Good morning and welcome to Free Advice Friday. My name is Keri Barnum for New Shelves Books, and today I am delighted to have a guest here. We have Jessica Berg, who is the founder of Draft Craft. She's a developmental editing editor, and she has developed this firm that is dedicated to nurturing and developing writers. She's got an MFA in fiction from Spalding University, and she's also an award-winning novelist and experienced editor herself. She is passionate about helping authors refine their narratives and enhance their craft. Jessica's collaborative approach and extensive experience, including roles with Writer's Digest, make her a sought-after expert in the literary community. She also offers master classes and workshops empowering writers with the tools they need to succeed. So, Jessica, welcome. We're excited to have you today.
Hey, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks so much for taking the time, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yes, me too, me too. So, for everyone who is watching, Jessica is very professional, but I know her. Know her, and she's also really cool. And she just has this gift for words and having such fun with words. And I think that's a lot of fun, is not just like, look, we all know there are editors who like the rules and there are editors who like the words. And I'm not saying you don't follow rules, but I know things. But also just the fact that like you really do look at the whole style. And I think that's really important in editing for most people. So I appreciate that, especially about you.
Oh, well, the kind words. So I hope I don't trip over too many of my own words, as you've just said how much I love them. But yeah, developmental editing really is such a passion for me. Early in my career, I realized that story and narrative are fascinating because there are all of these components that make it work. And I'm the kind of see the sausage made sort of person. So I really have taken the time to understand why story doesn't work and then how I can make it work. So it's like a puzzle to me. And I'm so excited to answer these questions that we've got today.
Yay. Well, we're going to get started with a question that we actually had emailed in. And this
Mhm.
question I think is really important because we talk a lot about publishing and marketing your book, which does fit both self-published and traditionally published authors. But this question is specific to those writers and authors who are hoping to land an agent. And the question is, if I am hoping to go the traditional route and land an agent, do I even need an editor, or will the publisher provide an editor for me? What do you think?
Yes, you definitely need an editor, right? There's two prongs to this. The publisher will provide some in-house editing for sure, but before you even take your work to an agent, I always recommend my clients to write the book 7 times. And that advice comes from my own agent, Amy Collins, who said, Jess, this is great, but go rewrite it. And I'm like, oh no, my fingers, my poor fingers, right?
Mhm.
But when I say rewrite, I literally mean rewrite it. One screen, and you are typing it out. And the reason I recommend that is because you see things in the work that you don't see if you're looking on a line level. And I'm coming back to the dev ed side of it here, Keri. So just bear with me while I'm very long-winded. Um, so in your own process, right? You're writing it 7 times, then you really know your work, you know your arc, you know your pacing, you know all of these things, and you are better equipped to then go shop for an editor who can help you with your own deficiencies. It does not serve you, your work, your career to find an editor who's amazing at character arc if your character arc is already spot on. And the only way for you to know if it's spot on is to rewrite it 7 times. So yes, the short answer to that is you absolutely need an editor. You need that professional polishing. And I think that it does improve your chances with an agent, right? You can send out your query letter, your synopsis, and those first 10 pages really confident in knowing that what you are presenting is the absolute best version of your work.
Yeah, and I will say that having an editor go through your work before you query an agent is not looking for perfection, but they are looking for pretty darn good. And if this is your first draft or even your second draft, or you're the only one who's read this, because we don't always spot our own flaws or the issues that might be in our own stories. So if you're the only one who's read this or your manuscript has not been edited, then you may be missing out on your chance of an agent. I am friends with a lot of agents. I talk to a lot of them, and I've heard more times than once, I loved the story idea, but they just weren't ready. And that sometimes you get a second chance, but a lot of times you don't. So really refining your manuscript before you get to the pitch stage can mean, getting success and getting that agent and even getting to a publisher faster. So I agree, it really is important there.
Absolutely. And the other thing that is always important to keep in mind here is you can't rush this process. I am a I am a frenetic sort of person, so I'm always looking for a way to be more efficient, to, round that corner as well I can. But in this industry, in this career, it's not possible. You have to sit and be patient and do the work. And sometimes that really does mean sending it off and waiting 3 months for your dev ed to come back with this gorgeous editorial letter and all of these actionable insights to help make that work better.
Right. And I often say publishing is one of the slowest industries you will ever be in. I love when people are like, well, I'd really like to publish next month. And I'm like, oh, do you mean next year? That might be possible.
Yeah.
Now, in some cases, some people have done the work to be a little further along, but in most cases, it's a slow process,
Yeah.
especially if you are trying to work with a traditional publishing house. So that's good feedback. Um,
Absolutely. Mhm.
and for everyone watching, I know that you really focus on dev editing, but can you give us like your quick one-liner definition for dev editing, line editing, and copy editing so we can just clarify between the three?
Definitely. So dev ed is big picture, which is plot, character development, pacing, thematic consistency. Line editing is sentence structure, clarity, and flow. Copy editing is grammar, punctuation, some style, and then proofreading are those final checks. It's the final polish.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mhm.
And so that's really important to note too, because it really does go kind of in that order as well. That dev editing is usually in the very beginning. This is, you don't want to polish before you know if your story and your arcs are on point. So dev editing is very much in the beginning places there.
Yes, absolutely. It's key, right? You don't want to invest any of your time or money or even effort into doing anything else before you know that your story stands.
Right. And so going back to that question with literary agents and traditional publishing, would you agree that in most cases, authors will want to invest in a dev edit? Sometimes they'll want to do a copy edit, but they don't necessarily need line or proofreading at that point if they kind of have to choose between which type of editing to work towards.
I sort of feel like that's a loaded question, Keri, and the reason is that for us prose fanatics over here, myself included, who write very long-winded purple kind of sentences, I need a line editor because I love every single word and I don't want to give any of them up. So if you are of that ilk, if you're on that bend toward literary, then you might want to add in that line edit step before you query or you send out. But for most people, if you're working in high concept, commercial fiction, or even genre fiction, just going with that dev ed first to start would probably be the best step.
I agree. And like you said, that you
Mhm.
love the words. And so you like to write all the words. And so knowing yourself, I think really helps with that as well.
Absolutely does, yeah.
Um,
Mhm.
oh, did you have something?
Oh, I was just going to say that's also one of the reasons why I'm such an advocate for the 7 drafts, because it is in learning your own personal style that then you can begin to see, okay, where are my gaps? Where are those places in my knowledge base that I might not necessarily be able to correct myself? So, like early in my career, I never would have said that I loved all the words and that I needed a line editor because I wasn't aware that I needed it, right? Like
Right.
craft constantly builds on itself. The more you learn, the more you realize, oh, there's always something else to know.
Exactly. Yeah. You're never no one ever, let me say this very loud and clear. No one ever, I don't care if you're Stephen King, gets the first draft out there and it's like, it's ready for publication. That's it. Nailed it.
Right.
Just
Right.
doesn't happen.
No, it definitely doesn't happen. Nor does that perfect first draft of your first chapter, nor does that ideal first line. Like all of that comes later because this craft is all about layering, right? It's going through every single iteration of every single draft and then coming back with something that feels like a polished product.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
And I think that's just really important that it's all about the polish. It's all about, everyone has the things that they're not great at and the things that they need extra set of eyes on. And so by having different people read your manuscript, your book along the
Mhm.
way, I have authors I work with who I'm their first reader, and then they have an editor, and then they have a dev edit, then they have a line edit, and then they have a proofread. And all along the way, there's different feedback every time. And it's like, oh yeah, how did none of us catch that? And it's just, we don't see our own deficiencies, as you kind of said. And so I think it's very important.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
When we're looking at an editor, number one, how do we know what type of editor we need? I know you mentioned, the 7 drafts where you kind of get a better sense, but how do we kind of decide which type of editor to jump into looking for?
It's a great question. Here, I think you should probably lean on your first readers, right? Those alpha and beta readers who you always shower with all the chocolates and all the wine and everything because they are doing you such a service by reading those early drafts. And so if you have 10 readers and 6 of them come back and say, this arc did not work for me, then you might want to seek out a developmental editor who focuses a lot on character arc. Or if you consistently get feedback that your pacing seems slow, then you might want to seek out that kind of editor. If 6 out of your 10 readers come back and say, I loved everything about it, you should then say, are you sure? Right? Like, let's clarify, let's make sure. And then maybe that's when you skip that big structural dev ed, but you still send to a dev ed and say, can you evaluate? Can you use your professional skills to determine whether or not my 6 readers are correct? And of
Mhm.
course, you hope that they are correct, but chances are that that dev ed's going to come back with something different, right?
Right. Right.
Mhm.
Well, and then from there, I mean, I think number one, we kind of have a folded in question of when do we use beta readers? And I think you just nailed it, is that your editor should not be the first person to read your manuscript, and they should not be reading a first draft. It is a waste of their time and your money to do
Mhm.
that.
Mhm.
You should have your first readers, your first readers, your beta readers, your alpha readers reading your manuscript and giving you feedback before you invest the time and the money in finding an editor.
100% agree, but they cannot be your friends because your friends will not be as harsh and as specific as we need them to be. I know if I send to my best writing buddy, she's going to be like, oh, I love this. Like, that's great, Jill, but that doesn't help me. Like, please tell me all the reasons why it's not working. So you really do need to cast that wide net, tap your social networks, find other writers who you feel like you might be on par with in terms of your craft level and send to them because they're going to give you that honest feedback.
Exactly. And this is why sometimes beta readers are your critique partners. They are other authors who are willing to do that. And I love that you specifically mentioned they can't be your friends, or it has to be a very special friendship to be able to do that because we don't like telling each other the hard truths. We want to be your cheerleader. And so it can be really hard to be like, I hate to say this, but I hated it.
Mhm.
And that is why we pay for services sometimes because that we don't have that issue. But when looking for
Mhm.
beta readers and critique partners, sometimes it's just your readers. If this is not your first book, the people who've already read your book and who don't know you personally. But having multiple beta readers or alpha readers is also important because you could have someone who just doesn't want to hurt your feelings. Or you could
Mhm.
have me who reads it and I'm like, this was terrible. I love you a lot. And the last sentence was fantastic. The rest, terrible. I don't ever really say it like that. I believe in the compliment sandwich. However,
Right.
I think that that is a really important point that finding people that don't, it's not that just because they like you, a lot of people can like you, it's that they want to be your cheerleader and they don't want to either cause tension because sometimes you can give hard feedback and the author does not like it. they will get mad. And I get this call from so many clients. They're like, got my edits back pretty angry.
Mhm,
And I'm like, well, let's sit with
mhm.
that for a minute. And if that's a personal relationship, that can be hard. So,
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's really important, right? When we think about our clients and when clients shop around for a dev ed, you have to accept that this is a collaboration, it's a partnership, it's a conversation, and you're not always going to love all of my feedback. That is also to say that you're not always going to want to accept all of my feedback. But if you've done your homework, your due diligence, and you've found the editor who's perfect for you, chances are you're already sort of aligned, right? Like you've already got some personality similarities or craft interest or even just genre interest that can help soften some of that. Because I get those calls too, Keri, and I'm like, okay, but did you see all the good stuff I said? Like, let's start there and then let's
yeah.
talk through it because I mean, these are our precious children, right? Like we slave and toil and it's so hard to write. It's so hard to write. And then when you give it over to somebody and then they come back with feedback that you might not necessarily expect, it's crushing. Like I get it too, right? Like I'm like, I'm not crying, you're crying. No, no, no. But it's really just part of the process. It really is.
It is.
Hmm.
Now, you mentioned that if you do your due diligence and if you've really done your research, that you should have less of this. And that's a really great point because we've got a question in the chat here. I've worked with two editors for my 116,000 word novel, but I'm not quite satisfied with their editing, mainly due to lack of match in genre. How can
Okay.
I find a suitable editor? Like what is the secret sauce to getting the right editor for your work?
I'm a big fan of Twitter for this kind of stuff, and I think that's because you get a wide net that can be cast out, right? You can ask your mutuals who they use. You can look at what an editor is posting, how they are engaging with the community, and what they are doing to give back, because it is a collaboration. And if you're not satisfied with your 116,000 word, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say maybe it's science fiction or fantasy novel, then you should be looking for that editor who is so genre focused for you, especially if you've already worked with two. This is probably a case of just a genre disconnect. If I'm coming at you from a literary perspective and I'm like, well, wait a minute, this is 116K. You need to cut 40,000 words before I even think about it, right? Because that is exactly what my first thought was. And then, okay, it's a genre fiction. So you have to align. It's just like dating. Like your first you don't marry everyone you date. You need to find that person with whom you feel comfortable to talk about the work and who you connect with on both a professional and a personal level.
Yes. And I think finding people asking the editors that you are considering, asking them what they love to read, what
Mhm.
genres they love to read, asking them what novels that they or books they have edited, what genres, and then going to check those out because they may give you a list of 20 well done, very successful novels that they helped work on. But if they're all in romance and you're in sci-fi, it's not going to be a good fit. So sometimes there can be a great editor that's not a great editor for you.
Exactly, exactly.
And
And it's probably frustrating to have gone through two editors already because it sort of feels like your arms are flailing and you're just looking for that support. So another way to do that would be to talk to authors who you admire, you appreciate their work, especially in genre fiction, and ask them for recommendations. Like everyone likes to help each other out, I think. Like it's a community that's built on that kind of service.
yes,
Hmm.
absolutely. And finding people. I know you mentioned Twitter, and Charlotte's asking, what's a good hashtag to find these people or to start this conversation on Twitter or X?
Well, I'm never going to call it X, first of all, because what are these? These are X's. I'm tweeting, okay? Uh, am writing is probably the best, widest hashtag that you could use. Right now on Twitter, it's indie fantasy month, I think.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of activity right now on Twitter, specifically in that fantasy genre. So that would be a really great way. I mean, you can also search by genre. Again, search by the authors whose work you feel like are comps to you and see who they're hanging out with, see who they're talking to. Because, you know, your hashtag might not reach out the right way. Like, I feel like this is sort of one of those legworks that you have to do on your own rather than relying on the algorithm. Because, I mean, look, he took away our likes. What's next? The hashtags? We don't know what's going to happen to Twitter tomorrow. So I would do it that way.
Yep. And in addition to Twitter, there are other places to find editors. There are sites like Readsy where you can look for people.
Yep.
Always recommendations from other authors where you enjoy their work or they write in the same genre as you. Where else would you look for an editor if you were looking?
I would look on Editorial Freelance Association, right?
Mhm.
My profile is there. All of my editor friends' profiles are there. You can see what we've done. It's sort of our CV is presented. So that's a really great way to get a sense of who the person is. Fiverr is also a really great place to look for editors, especially if you're looking for like only copy or line. That's a great place. But dev eds are there too. And I don't think a lot of people use Fiverr in that way. So the prices feel very much under industry standards. So I would check out both of those.
Yes, I would say that if you are looking at Fiverr, make sure that the person that you hire is very well versed or a native speaker in the language that the book is written. I've run into that quite a bit.
Absolutely key. But here again, right, it comes back to that due diligence. It's doing your homework. It's not just saying, oh, I like the color of her blouse, so I'm going to choose this person as my editor. You really need to know who they are, what they stand for, how they approach work, because not every editor looks at narrative in the same way, right? Like, do you want someone who's going to give you specific generative exercises to help with those gaps in your knowledge base? Or do you want someone who's going to give you a ton of margin comments, right? Like, it is that collaboration. It's a partnership. It is not, in my opinion, it is not a one-off sort of thing where, okay, and then you move on to another editor. Ideally, you find that person with whom you can then grow your career. And as you grow, they grow, because we should always be learning. We should always be improving our crafts. And then you've kind of got your person, right? And that person is the person that goes with you for however long you're in this space.
Right. And I also think that it's important. I know sometimes we've mentioned it earlier that publishing is a slow process, and sometimes it's tempting to just go with the editor who has the first available spot, and that is not always a good thing.
Mhm.
Now, sometimes great editors do just have an empty spot for one reason or another, but just going because they can fit you in next week doesn't mean that they're a great editor. Now, it doesn't mean they're a terrible editor, but waiting for a good fit is worth it. I mean, as Justice said, it's a relationship. So waiting for the right fit can really mean the difference between not only wasted time and wasted money, but also like the best success that you could possibly get for your manuscript and for your book.
Absolutely. It's like selecting a tattoo artist, right? Like, you do not pop back a few with your buddies and walk down Main Street and walk into the first shop you see, right? Or you shouldn't, ideally. You
Is
should
that what
research.
I
You
did
should find.
wrong? Darn it.
Well, I mean, that's why it looks the way it does. No, but it's the same thing, right? It's permanent in that way that you are investing a lot of money, right? And you don't want to just throw it away on something that's awful.
Yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Mhm.
And for people who are in the process of, looking for editors, are there specific questions they should be asking before hiring an editor?
Yes, definitely. I think that there are a ton of questions you should be asking anyone who you're thinking about hiring. And that's because, here again, it's just stressing what that relationship is, what it looks like, and what you want out of it. So, for example, you might want to ask, can you provide a sample edit? I know some people sort of get angry about that, because it feels like you're producing work for free, but really, if you are unwilling to provide a sample edit on 250 or 500 words, maybe that's not the person for you. You definitely want to know what experience they have in your genre if you're a genre writer. You can ask for references or testimonials from previous clients. And my big question is always, what does your process look like? So, do you Does the editor provide an editorial feedback letter and a ton of margin comments? Do you have a conversation before the work starts and then again after? How is that going to feel for you as the author as you move through this process? So how the editor communicates their feedback. Obviously, you also want to know what the rates are and if they offer packages. So if you are like me and you know you're going to need a line editor, does your dev ed also do line edits? And can you kind of combine those two services to be something more? Another key question that I feel like not enough people ask is how many rounds of edits do you include? Sometimes it's only one round of edit. If this is a big structural edit and I've spent, you know, 3 weeks with a manuscript completely taking it apart, it's probably going to only be that one round, because then I expect the author to take all of my feedback and spend the next 6 months rewriting it. And then they might come back and we can do another edit, but it's not going to be as in depth because ideally they've done the work. And then obviously you definitely want to know what the turnaround time is. You keep mentioning how slow publishing is, and it really is, and editing is not averse to that, right? Like we are just as slow as every other part of this process. So if you need this back in 2 weeks, you probably should have booked like 4 months ago. So you need to know what that looks like, right? And then of course, I like knowing what kind of education and what kind of qualifications an editor has. So I have an MFA. I'm really big into craft. I love learning about craft. I am literally always reading at least one craft book. And so I'm always trying to learn more. And that helps me stay up on industry trends and standards, etc. And then finally, a question that I do get quite often is, can you help me with a query letter and with my submission package? And my answer is always yes, because I really love working on these things. I feel like query letters are that first introduction, between the author and the agent, and there are certain guideposts that we can use to make your query letter perfect.
Yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, you mentioned the slow process, and I want to pick that apart a little bit more because I've heard in places where people say things like, well, why does it take an editor so long? I can read a book in a day, in a weekend. So
Mm-hmm.
editing obviously is different. It's like literally a different mental process. So can you give us an idea of, I mean, not just why it takes so long, because I think we all have an idea, but like how much can you really work on at a time? Do you have to take a lot of breaks and step away from the manuscript? Like, how does that look from an editor standpoint?
Yes. So I use Trello for all of my clients, and I do that because I can make cards specific to the project and it gives me my big picture. So I definitely need to take it in chunks when I'm providing actionable feedback. But when I am doing my first read, I want to read it just the way I read any other novel. I want to sit down, have my beverages, my snacks, my blanket, my go away sign to my family, and I want to consume it. Because ideally, that's what we want from our readers, right? We want them to forget the world, we want them to forget responsibility and just dive right in. So on my first pass, I never let my editorial brain click on, because if I do, I'm going to pick it apart immediately, and then it's like no fun for anyone. And then I let it sit. So why does this process take so long? Because I cannot come back to your work objectively if I've just read it in one weekend. I can't come to it Monday morning because I'm still going to be so close to it. It's the same on the other side with authors, right? Like we can't revise right after we drafted because we're not going to see it for what it needs. So I let it rest a week. And by that time, I've already read another 2 books, right? Like it's pushed back in my mind a little bit. And then I can come back and I can do a big pass based on what I remember. I always like to come from what I remember first. Okay, I remember that it felt a little slow in the second act. Okay, I couldn't identify the first pinch point. Okay, I really didn't see a nice climax, right? That's coming from memory. And then I'll go through and I'll read the first 50 pages, because by the first 50 pages, we should have, our main character should be introduced. We should know our internal and external conflicts. We should know what our inciting incident is, and we should know if our main character is choosing to go on their mission. And so then I'll pause there and I'll sort of pick it apart and I'll create a bunch of Trello cards, and then I'll do the second act, and then I'll do the third, and then I'll read it again. So we've read it now 3 times, and I'm still not ready to provide any feedback because I want to be as objective as I can be. And so after that final third act reading, I'll go back and I'll read it once more, and I'll think to myself, okay, how do my opinions of this narrative, how have they changed from start to now? And then what can we do to make all of this more cohesive, to improve the narrative structure, to increase the pacing, to increase the conflict? And only then do I write my editorial letter. So I can sit with a work for 3 to 4 weeks, and only then I'm ready to send it back.
Right. And so I think that's really important for people to realize that it's not just a read through. It's not even just a read through and giving you my opinion, that
Right.
it is stages of reading. And it is, maybe the first reading is quick, but
Mhm.
that editorial piece, it's slow. You're reading it with, like you said, I click it on and off. And I think that's so funny because I was trying to explain this to my husband about the difference of like reading and reading for feedback and how different it is. That like you then are like, well, will everyone get this reference? Will this make sense? It's not, you're of course taking your own opinions, but you're also trying to think about the audience at large, which is a very different task than just reading a book.
Absolutely agree. And you're talking about like, will the audience understand this reference, right? Those anachronisms. I see this a lot in historical fiction, and it immediately jumps out to me because I'm looking for it, right? Or if I'm in some other genre and okay, this meet cute is not working, and here's why. But I am the type of editor that I can't just say this isn't working. Like I can't do that. I have to tell you why it's not working, and then I have to give you these generative exercises to make it work. Because ultimately, like if there's a gap in that knowledge and I know how to fix it, I need you to learn how to fix it so that when you come back with another book, we've fixed that and we've moved on to a new problem, right? Like I am all about empowering authors to understand the craft in that way.
Right.
Mm.
And I think that is also a mark of a really great editor is not just pointing out what's wrong, but solutions or ideas for solutions, because
Yeah.
no one wants just that doesn't work. It's that doesn't work. Tell me why, and then give me some ideas of how I can help or fix it. And that is
Mhm.
an important piece. And I think that's also something to ask an editor when you're consider working with them is not only how do you provide feedback, but do you point out the issues? When you point out the issues, do you also give me possible solutions, or am I on my own for that? Because you might be surprised how many
Yeah.
editors do not offer possible solutions.
Right, because so many editors consider that to be in the educational realm of craft. And I'm like, these things overlap, guys. Like it's all one and the same. So if I can identify that you have an issue with pacing, I'm not just going to say, oh, the pacing is terrible. See you later. Like, let's talk about it. Let's understand from that very basic level what pacing is first, because some of my clients will come to me and they just don't know what they don't know, right? Like they're not aware that each scene needs to have whatever hallmarks of the scene and each chapter needs to serve this way. And so it really, to me, and every editor is different, but it is educating and it is making stronger writers through this really generative active process.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do
Mhm.
have a question from Beth. You've mentioned that you use Trello cards. So she's wondering if you could just explain Trello a little bit more.
Oh yeah, Trello is amazing. It is a project management tool that I use. It's free. I'm sure there's a paid version that you can use as well, but you create boards. And so I'm a really visual person. I like to see all of my information at once. So you create a board. So let's say I'm creating a board for you, Beth. You are my new client. It'll have your name and the title of your work. And then I'll have cards, first act, second act, third act. And within those cards, I can make notes, I can create checklists, I can ask myself questions. And I'm using that as an interactive tool so that I don't come away with like a notebook full of messy, terrible left-handed handwriting that I can't understand. It's really an active way for me to record my process of what I'm thinking as I'm reading things. And then if, for example, I notice in every chapter we've got an issue with with pacing, then I might create a card that says pacing, and I'll think about, oh, what are my favorite craft books about pacing that I can then recommend to you? Or I'll take a chunk, I'll copy it direct from your manuscript, I'll put it on a Trello card, and I'll think about a generative exercise for that. And so that just helps me see the process in a really holistic way. And I don't know if every editor uses it or even any editor uses it, but it's my process and it definitely works for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I've seen editors work in a lot of different ways with a lot of different things, but
Yeah.
and again, that's important. Like, how much feedback do I get? What am I going to get? Are you going to help lead me in the right direction? And all of those questions are really important. And you mentioned pacing, and we did have a question emailed in about pacing. Is number one, how do I know if my pacing is off? And number two, if it is off, what does that mean and what do I do about it?
Okay. So, pacing is all about, like, let's think of pacing on the scene level. Every scene needs to have certain things, right? We've got a character who is presented with a problem or a challenge. We then have the character thinking about what they want to do. After they've thought that through, we have the action, right, from here. So then we have the action. Then after the action, we have another moment of reflection, or the character is considering whether or not this action helped this problem. And then we have a new problem or a new idea for the next scene. So if we're looking at scene in that way, where we've got these 5 guideposts, then take your work. Do you have your character presented with a problem or a conflict? Do you have a moment where that character considers what to do? Do you have them acting on that consideration? Do you have them reflecting on that consideration? And then do you have them evaluating and developing a new thought, new action for the next plan? So if you're not seeing that in your scenes, chances are maybe your pacing is a little bit off. So that's the first level to evaluate how your pacing feels within the work. Secondly, if you are working with an action-driven scene, for example, look at the length of your sentences. Do you have super long sentences with 12 clauses and a bunch of adjectives? You probably don't need it, right? You need your pacing to be jumpy, to be sparky, to be really quick, because this is an action scene. Are
Mhm.
you in a reflective scene where your character is catching the breath from just running from whomever? Then those sentences can be longer, should be longer, because we're allowing the reader to take a breath with us, right? So we're thinking about that in looking at scene and in looking at pacing. Another way to do this, if you feel like that's maybe a little inaccessible to you in your level of craft knowledge, is to use an app I love called Fictionary. And there is a free version. There's also a paid version, and it helps you see whether or not your pacing is working for your entire narrative. So now we're taking away the scene, right? And we're looking at it from a holistic way. Do you have your rising action? Are you coming up against a plot point? Do you have your next plot point coming to your midpoint and then you're coming down? So I love to use both of those things in looking at my own work before I send to my editor to say, okay, is this pacing working for me?
And I think part of it, for the simplest way to put pacing that I use often, is pacing is kind of, think of it like a movie. Is it a slow movie or are you entertained the whole time? Like, as a very simplistic way of putting it, is we've all seen those movies. Like, we all saw, what was it? Castaway, where like it was so slow. It was a brilliant movie. It was so slow. That pacing was slow but brilliant.
Yeah. Yeah. But that character was also by himself the entire time. And to drive narrative when you're by yourself is incredibly difficult. I'm so glad you brought this up, because I see this where it'll be like 10 pages of the character on their own. And I'm like, no, no, we can't have this, guys. This is why your pacing is not working, because we want to see your character interact with someone else. We want to see how they respond to their environment. You can't give me 10 pages of them walking through the woods having an apple. Okay, what does that do, right? That slows everything down.
Exactly. And we want,
Mhm.
as a reader especially, if we're skipping pages, that's a problem. Because if we skip enough pages, we're not going to keep reading. And so I think
Okay.
that's one of those things. If you do get alpha or beta feedback, they may not say pacing is an issue, but they might say this part was slow, or this was a little bit boring for me. those are
Mhm.
the types of things that you should kind of note as that's a pacing issue.
Mhm.
And, think about, I love that you kind of had that process of what's the action, what's the action, the problem, the reflection, because
Mhm.
that's what we want. And as much as, some of the best novels that kept you up turning the page, most of them kind of ended a chapter not on a cliffhanger, but on the precipice of the next big thing. And that's
Yes.
why we keep turning the pages, even though we're like, okay, it's past bedtime. And that's
Yes.
what we want as writers.
Absolutely. And I think another way of distilling this is if your pacing is off, it's because you don't have enough conflict. And that's the fundamental of all narrative, right? Is conflict. So if it feels like there's nothing happening, that's because nothing is happening. Introduce more conflict. It cannot only be an internal conflict. We need to see external forces coming up against your main character, coming up against their core need, their core wound, all of the things, because that's what drives the plot forward. And that in turn fixes the pacing, right?
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And so I think that gives us a really good idea of like, okay, if this is an issue, and know that if pacing is an issue with one novel, I love that you talked about like thinking about craft books that might help, because if you know that was an issue, go read about it. Go do some
Yeah.
research with craft books, or go find a book that is really known for the pacing, or an author that's known for that, and take note. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
sometimes just seeing it done really well, and
Mm-hmm.
when you're paying attention to it, like sometimes we just know this was an amazing book and we don't really realize why. But then if we're like, okay, this person is known for their pacing, let me go read that, and you're paying attention, it's suddenly like you're realizing all of the technique that goes into it. And you're like, oh, I get it. Because I'm a visual learner, but when that translates into writing in books is more that like you can tell me what pacing is all day long. And I'd be like, I think I get it. But if you're like, okay, this book has good pacing, and I'm like, oh, okay, that was easy. And so I
Yeah,
think that might help as well.
absolutely. And here again is a great way to, developing your writing community by asking for recommendations. Hey, what's a book you love that you felt like the pacing was top notch? And it might be out of your genre that you normally read, which is great because we should all read so widely. As authors, we cannot just only read the things that make our hearts tick. We've got to read it all. And then you'll find that book, and to your point, Keri, you'll see exactly how it's working. The MFA in me would also suggest then that you write like a critical essay about it. You look at it like on a really, really micro level to help take those skills that that author has and pull them into your own toolbox. Of course, that's laborious and like super nerdy, but hey, I think I've established that about me by now.
You guys missed before we went live, we were talking about how many computer monitors is too many. I have three currently, and Jessica wants to outpace me, so I'm gonna have to go get like another two or three. But um, so
You
I
can never
love
have
that.
too
And
many.
one question from Charlotte is, what happens when you have um two editors who maybe give conflicting advice?
Ooh.
How do you know what's right or what's to go with? So maybe your developmental editor says something, and then your copy editor kind of says the opposite. How do you know which to go with?
Ooh. Um, well, I think if you're judging between dev ed and copy editing, you might get conflicting advice, right? Like a developmental editor is definitely looking at the structure of it all, at the arc and the nuance of story. And your copy editor is looking at, those higher level things. So let's can we revise to be two dev eds giving
Sure.
conflicting advice? Because I feel like that then it's a little bit more of an even playing field. So um well, if one dev ed says the pacing is bad and the other dev ed says the pacing is fine, I think you behooves you to go get an outside opinion, not from a developmental editor, but from a beta reader who you don't know, and to ask specifically, how do you feel about this pacing? And if that person, whatever side that person ends up landing on, now you have a majority consensus. And the majority consensus is generally the right thing. Now, if you get feedback from two different dev eds about two different things and none of it tracks at all, this might be an example of a case where your collaboration efforts with these developmental editors isn't the best. Like it doesn't suit you. It doesn't serve you. It doesn't serve your story or your career. Um, but I think if a copy editor is saying, hey, the pacing is wrong, your dev ed should have already caught that, right? Like
Right.
we shouldn't be talking
Hopefully.
about pacing by the time we're with copy editors.
Right. And
Mhm.
if it is the fact of like, I've also seen where a copy editor will come in and will change some things or suggest changes that are on that line level. And
Mhm.
sometimes I will hear authors say, well, my last editor didn't say that was a problem. Keep in mind that each type of editor is focusing on different things. So that's not to say your developmental editor would not, if you spelled a word wrong, it's not to say that they wouldn't notice that, but they are not focusing on that. So sometimes the fact that they didn't say anything doesn't mean it's not an issue. It means that you can only focus on so much at one time, and their focus is different than a copy or a line editor who is really focusing on sentence structure. And so it's not to say that one's wrong and one's right. It's that
Right.
they weren't looking for the same thing, so you won't find the same things.
Exactly right. I mean, you don't go to your general practitioner for a dermatology issue, right? You want to go to the dermatologist. Same thing here. Hmm.
Exactly. Exactly.
Hmm.
On this issue of finding an editor and cost, obviously we know that editors spend a lot of time on their craft and cost. We have Beth here saying that it's very frustrating to compare costs because some editors do a project fee, some go by the word, and some go by the hour. So do you
Hmm.
have any tips for authors who are kind of looking for editors? And I mean, just like anything, cost is not everything, but you have to consider it if you have a budget. Do you have any suggestions for which one might be, because a lot of these are estimates. So which one might be the most accurate? If there's a way to ask if someone typically does a per project and you're asking them, do you do this by word, or how do you suggest that authors go about that discussion of money, which can be awkward, but shouldn't be awkward? How do we go about that?
First, check the current EFA rates because most of my editor buddies do set our rates based on what the Editorial Freelance Association is saying. These are the rates. So if you find someone whose rates are crazy low in comparison, that probably should give you pause because, okay, why is it so low? If you want to work on a project cost versus a word cost, I think it's important to really clearly define a statement of work. And when I say define it, I mean both of you sign off on it. It is as legally binding as these things can be, because then you have the expectation of what you're going to get back from your author, or sorry, from your editor. If you want to work on a per word level, I think that that serves when your manuscript is maybe on the lower ends, right? 60, 70, 80,000 words. You don't want to do that if you've got a behemoth like 116,000 word science fiction
Right.
fantasy novel because it's going to end up costing you more. Um, I also think that the per word is a little bit nitpicky. Like I charge per package. Like here's our project, here's what you're going to get. If you have 70,000 words, if you have 90,000 words, if you have 100,000 words, because I know that my level of effort that I put into it is going to be the same no matter what your word count is. So, it's feeling comfortable. It's coming back to that idea that this is a collaboration, it's a partnership. It is not going to buy a soda. Like it's a really, really big deal. And so you need to feel comfortable about that. Um, and lots of editors will also do half up front, half at the end or monthly installments or something because we're not here. I mean, obviously we like to make money, everyone does, but we're really here to see your work succeed. Like that's the driving force of a good editor.
Yes, it is. I
Mhm.
mean, it's very much a partnership. I say the same thing when I work with people is that I have to get paid. I do have bills and, I do have to get paid, but really I'm invested. I can't tell you how many times I am the first person texting people way too late at night when they like I found out someone hit USA today and I'm texting them at like 2 in the morning and I'm like, so sorry. Oops. But we worked
Yeah.
together for 5 years, and this has been a goal since the beginning. Like it really does become a relationship
Mhm.
where it becomes something where you are invested as well. And so that's what you want from anyone you work with, though. Like you put a lot into your book, and you want someone who cares about your success. Maybe not as much as you do, because that's pretty much impossible to hit, but someone who cares a lot about your success, who invests in not just getting the job done to get paid, but in you as the artist, I think is something that is amazing when you find it.
Yeah, it really is. And coming back to those questions to ask an editor, ask for a pre-project call. Do a
Mhm.
Zoom call as much as we're all like Zoom tired. See what their personality is like. Do you like them? Like on a fundamental level, do you like them? Because you're going to be
Yeah.
working with them a lot. And if you cannot connect on a personal level, then chances are when they say, so listen about that pacing, you're not going to be receptive to it because you can't be.
Yes,
Mhm.
communication, I would say not just like not just do you have communication, but the way you communicate. Some people communicate much different than others, and sometimes it is just not a good fit. And that's okay. Just like
Yeah.
not everyone we meet and are polite to publicly is not our best friend. That's okay. Some people you're not going to click with, and that's really important because if you don't like someone just rubs you the wrong way, or you don't feel like you communicate, or maybe like they use sarcastic humor a lot and that, hurt your feelings, whatever it is, it's just not a good fit. It doesn't matter how great they are at what they do. If you
Yeah.
can't communicate well, it's going to be an issue.
Absolutely agree. Yeah. So ask for that pre-project call and just see how they are.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Well, we're running up on the end of our hour. It went so fast because we had so much to talk about, but I wanted to show everybody, and I did drop it in the chat and we'll drop it again. But Jessica's website is draftcraft.me. And right when you go in, there's this big thing where you join the newsletter. And I wanted to show you what you get if you join the newsletter. Jess has this fabulous kind of the essentials here with character growth and dialogue and dynamic settings and show don't tell. So all of these really amazing tips and information. So I just wanted to show you guys that if you want that freebie download, just go join her newsletter. And again, that's just draftcraft.me. And you can always reach out to her as well. There's like all the ways to connect with her because I see all these people who are like, hey, how do we be friends? Well, that is the
Yeah.
way, going to the website and reaching out that
Yes.
way.
Yes, always love to interact. Come be friends with me on all the places. It's the same name everywhere. This has been such an illuminating and delightful conversation. Such great questions, Keri. I really appreciate the opportunity to chat with you and to talk about Dev Ed.
Yeah, of course. We were so excited to have you. Everyone, thank you for being here. We'll be back next week for just more of our marketing and publishing talk. And of course, go follow Jessica at Draftcraft. Super fun, aside from being super knowledgeable, she's also fun. So thank you for being here, and we appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much. See you soon.
Bye bye.
Bye.